Okay, it is exactly 11, so we will get started. Before I begin with our third and final day of the Mountain Pacific Health Science Libraries Conference 2021, I did have to read that off the website page. I would like to acknowledge and thank the Lekwungen people, also known as the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations community, for allowing me to live, work, and play on their lands. If you would like to acknowledge the people on whose land you live, please feel free to add your comments to the chat. If you don't know whose land you live on, please check out the welcome packet for some helpful resources. Welcome everyone to the third and final conference day. Reminder that closed captioning is available. There's a closed caption box at the bottom of the Zoom screen to turn those on and off. This session is being recorded, and in fact, this particular session is being double recorded. So it's being recorded once for the conference and once for a podcast called Organizing Ideas that I'll talk about in a moment here. There is the code of conduct, and there's also Padlet collaborative note-taking links that will be in the chat from our tech assistant, Dana. So feel free to contact her if you have any tech problems as well. Please feel free to keep your cameras off and mics off if that's more comfortable. There will be approximately 40 minutes of moderated discussion among the panelists, and then there's going to be about 15 minutes for questions and answers from the audience. Please feel free to drop your questions in the chat at any point throughout the discussion. Our panelists today are Patricia Devine, Jessie Lawyer, and Andrea Kang. The panelists are going to introduce themselves in a moment, but for now, it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today, Karen Eng from the Organizing Ideas podcast, which is a podcast that looks at the relationships between organizing information and community organizing. With episode titles like Library Power Structures with Barak Yousefi. If you are interested in social justice, this is actually a great podcast to check out. I will just quickly drop a link in this chat so that people can check it out if they'd like to. And without further ado, I will turn the stage over to Karen.
Great, thank you so much. So welcome everybody to our panel on social justice, power structures, and health librarianship. And a big thank you to Larry for this invitation to be here. My name is Karen Eng, and I'll be moderating this panel. And so along with Allison Jones, who is unfortunately not able to be here today, I'm the co-host of the Organizing Ideas podcast. And today I'm calling in from the traditional territories of the Lekwungen speaking peoples, including the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanish peoples. And our guests today are Andrea Kang, Patricia Devine, and Jessie Loyer. Andrea Kang is a research and instruction librarian at Tufts University, Hirsch Health Sciences Library in Boston. She is also the liaison to the Graduate School of Biomedical Sciences and provides support for research data management. Andrea received a BA in East Asian Studies with a minor in history at Smith College in Northampton in 2013. After teaching in South Korea for 3 years, she earned her MIS at the University of Michigan School of Information in 2019. Professional interests and passions are in teaching and anti-racism work within libraries. Patricia Devine is a medical librarian at the University of Washington in Seattle. She is the director of community outreach and Healwa, which is an online library for selected healthcare providers in Washington state, funded by a portion of their license fees. Her interests include health disparities, social determinants of health, and implicit bias. During the pandemic, she has continued to highlight resources on COVID-19 and health disparities for the healthcare providers she serves. Jessie Lawyer is Cree Métis and a member of the Michel First Nation. She is a liaison librarian at Mount Royal University in Calgary. Her research looks at Indigenous perspectives on information literacy, supporting language revitalization, and creating ongoing research relationships through kinship. She's a director with the Prairie Indigenous Relationality Network, or Pasqua Wakotowin, which connects Prairie scholars researching relationality. I'm very excited about this panel and talking about power structures and justice and their work in health librarianship. So to begin, if there's anything I missed, please share. And also if you could tell us a little bit about how you got into this field and this area of interest, or how and why you decided to pursue this kind of work that you're doing.
Yeah, sure. So I guess I'll start. Karen, is that okay? Okay, so thank you for the introduction. So as my bio said, I'm actually a very new librarian. I've been in the field for about 1.5 years, going on 2 years this June, which I'm very excited about. And so when you actually reached out to me, I was a little bit nervous about this because I was like, do I even have enough experience to be a part of this panel? But that said, I feel like I have always been sort of interested in anti-racism work since my time as an undergraduate student at my institution, and this was a predominantly white institution and quite affluent. And during my time there, I really grew sort of as a student and just understanding what it means to do this kind of work. There were like a series of racist and homophobic attacks that had happened during my time there, and that really led me and a lot of my peers to start organizing around some demands that we had for our institution. And that led us to go into the college archive to figure out what folks were doing in the past. And so that's really where my interest in anti-racism work coincided with information science. And so, you know, I sort of started there and then continued on with teaching experiences and things like that. But then once I got to my job here in the library, I'm trying to figure out ways to continue that interest in some of the projects that I've been pursuing. So I guess that's sort of how I got started in terms of my interests in this work and trying to figure out how to continue that in my current role.
Well, I'm Pat Devine, and I first became aware of discrepancies in access to health care and health information when I started working for the National Network of Libraries of Medicine. The Medline Plus database was introduced by the National Library of Medicine in 1998 to address the health information needs of healthcare consumers. And in my work with NNLM, we focused on promoting this resource to underserved healthcare consumers. So I became aware of the differences between the underserved audiences and those who had lots of access to healthcare and information. As I started to work more with healthcare professionals, I learned about the implicit bias test, which was created in the late 90s by researchers at Harvard, the University of Washington, and the University of Virginia, and implicit bias and how it affects healthcare, the social determinants of health, and the history of racism in healthcare all contribute to create an unequal system. I think medical librarians can make a big difference in this realm through education and raising awareness. And that's where my interests lie, in doing that and helping to teach other librarians how to do that.
So I'll finish us off for this first question. My name is Jessie Lawyer. That's authentic. I'm a librarian that doesn't do health librarianship, and so I do feel like a bit of an interloper on this panel. But I was lucky enough early in my career to see a call for an editor, a guest editor for the Journal of Canadian Health Libraries Association. This is probably at this point in 2013. And I was a very new librarian at the time. I had not thought about research in that way. But I knew a lot about health disparities from being a Native person. And so I was interested and I thought about it. And really one of the things that I was bringing to that guest editorship was a sense of the way that indigeneity is often pathologized in health literature. Often the only times that we see indigeneity pop up is largely through understanding the ways that we are like ridden with disease, all of the social determinants of health that kind of affect us differently. And so I was paired with Jim Henderson, who is a retired health librarian. He's non-Native, but together we kind of became a dream team, worked together to kind of bring together this special issue, which I think is still really interesting. And in it, I was able to chat a little bit about specifically non-insured health benefits, which was something that I knew from my own life in dealing with the healthcare system. How do you basically pay for healthcare in Canada as a status Indian or as an Inuk that is part of a land claim? But but a lot of people didn't, right? And so it was something that had shaped my own experience with healthcare. And I thought that it was important for librarians that work in this field to just be aware of this kind of important component of the way that Native people interact with healthcare. So I was really delighted to work with Maria Smalllegs, who at the time was the Treaty 7 Corporation NIHB navigator. And so working with the navigators who do this work, who really just update Indigenous people about what the government is actually providing through this fairly limited program. But that's my relationship with health librarianship and the way that kind of I've been thinking about these disparities from the start.
Thank you. So to get into our discussion, I want to ask how the three of you approach education around information and power structures and social justice. And I know social justice is a very nebulous term. And so if you'd like to address what that term means to you in your work, in your positionality or context, I welcome you to do so, and how you navigate this in your work and in your workplaces as well.
Yeah, I guess when I was thinking about the answer to this question, in terms of social justice, I honestly, sometimes I don't even know how to define it because I think for everyone it means something different, like you said. For me, I think that I've looked at it from a racial and socioeconomic lens, and I guess trying to figure out ways to help folks who are from minoritized backgrounds feel empowered to learn in spaces that they come to. So two things that I wanted to talk about was that, you know, I guess looking at my day-to-day job currently as a librarian, I work with a lot of students, a little bit less so than my colleagues right now, but still I do work with a lot of students. And even before as an ESL instructor, I used to work with students as well. And I think I've noticed similar things during my time as an ESL instructor, as well as while I'm here as a librarian. And one of the biggest things that I've noticed is that learners, when they come to meet you in the classroom or in a consultation, or when they're just, you know, coming to you at the help desk to figure things out, they're not really coming to you with a blank slate. They're coming to you with a lot of insecurities and baggage and fears that they have, especially people who might not necessarily have been exposed to a research background or are from marginalized communities. And so I think that I sort of see my job as a way to, or trying to figure out how to make an environment where, one, those fears are acknowledged and talked about before we get to the learning process, and then also figuring out ways to balance that power dynamic in terms of like showing the learner that they're not the only one that's learning, like I'm also learning with them. And this actually, I feel like it goes really well in the health sciences librarian field, because at least from my knowledge, and definitely for me, I'm not a clinician. So there are a lot of health related information that I just don't know because I'm not a trained clinician. And so like just showing them that I'm also learning about what they're doing, and they're actually the experts in their research, I think gives off sort of a more balanced power dynamic in that learning experience. And so that's one thing that I've strived to do, I guess, in terms of balancing out that power structure and that dynamic within that learning space. And another thing that I, actually this was summed up really perfectly in a tweet a while ago on Martin Luther King Jr. Day here in the United States, where someone was tweeting that, and this was targeted towards teachers, saying that, you know, if Black students don't feel heard and seen and supported before your Martin Luther King Jr. Day lesson plan on anti-racism, they're definitely not going to feel that way during your one-time lesson plan. And I think that this goes for any kind of racial justice, social justice work, is that you can't just do something that one time and be done with it, right? And I'm still learning as a librarian what that means and what that looks like in terms of how I can insert myself into these projects and into these groups where I can continue to do this work, not just on a singular day, but on an everyday basis with my job. But I think it's really important to make sure that you know, you're doing this work constantly. And I guess that's sort of how I have been navigating that and approaching education around that. So yeah.
Well, I really like Andrea's observation that the health disparities and concepts need to be something that we're thinking about all the time, and not just for special occasion, and worked into our work on a daily basis. I think that librarians can make a big difference in research and practice by bringing awareness of health disparities into search results. For example, someone who asks you to do a search might not be aware of the disparities around that particular condition or test, and being aware of that ourselves and adding mesh terms that would bring those results, bring in those search results is a really good way to do that, just as an everyday thing. We can also create lib guides and about health disparities, and in general raise awareness of the problems. The medicine, nursing, and allied health fields are aware of the issues and discrepancies and are usually open to resources and education. More so all the time, I think. So the barriers are starting to come down, although there are always sacred cows in medicine that need to be debunked. Not sometimes about other things that have been since proven otherwise with new evidence, but especially as far as health disparities and treatment of certain groups in different ways. So it's our job as librarians to know about those issues and to educate and teach about them and advocate. I think understanding the history of racism in medicine and how it affects practice today is something that librarians can include in presentations and research consultations. The history of racism, sometimes called weathering in healthcare, affects the health of people of color today. Even if they're not in a disadvantaged situation, the history of where they came from still affects their health. And I think that that's one of the issues we can be very aware of as educators, and bring that to the forefront in our work with clinicians and researchers and students. And social justice isn't a term I use a lot, but health disparities and social determinants of health are more descriptive, I think, when we're talking about healthcare.
So for me, I think two of the biggest barriers that I face in the work that I do, and my focus is on students, right? I teach to undergraduate students. The two barriers that I see the most are this kind of history, this legacy of extractive research. And the second is sort of AI and new technology replicating those biases that we all kind of bring to things, these terrible human biases. For the first one, oftentimes getting students to really have a sense of the fact that the research environment that we exist in is a pretty terrible legacy that has been given to us that has largely come from very extractive research, right? So we have hundreds of years of research that has largely been extractive, outsiders coming into communities, asking questions that they were interested in, rather than those communities kind of giving shape to the questions that researchers are using to guide their research. A really useful way to orient yourself around this from an Indigenous perspective is Adam Gaudry's article called Insurgent Research. And in it, he really defines kind of, especially for Indigenous people, this legacy of extractive research that we've seen, right? And he posits that insurgent research, where the community is deciding what those questions might be, and the researcher is largely kind of decentralized from that process. They're kind of a tool for the community to to gain knowledge together. I think that's a really useful reorientation when we're thinking about kind of this like overwhelming history that we kind of have to take on. So that's one of the biggest challenges, and one that comes up quite often in the teaching that I do. The second one is seeing the way that the tech that we use is replicating human bias, right? So we have these hundreds of years of extractive research, and then as we're implementing new tech, AI, neural nets that are kind of thinking broadly, helping us do this work, those human biases are being replicated there. We can see this in the way that so much of medicine is not really familiar with diagnosis on darker skin, right? We can see that replicated in the technology that is being used even now. And so there's really exciting work being done. Muteli Nkonde is looking at anti-Blackness in AI, right? And so we see that those things intersect in the health field in really big ways, because we're often using tech at a really exciting rate, right, to change the work that we're doing. So for me, those are the two biggest barriers that kind of crop up again and again, and they're these perennial issues, right, that we see.
Yeah, thank you. Andrea and Patricia, do you also want to talk about some of like the major barriers and challenges that come up in your work?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges for me is, I guess, in terms of teaching and in terms of having space to talk about some of these biases, like Jessie mentioned, with like tech playing a role in diagnoses and things like that. You know, one of the biggest challenges for me, I think, is figuring out how to talk about it while also getting the things that we need to get done in terms of like teaching them how to use PubMed, or like, you know, teaching them the granular skills that they need, and figuring out ways to incorporate that. And I think it's so true that like these things do need to be addressed in those lessons, but it's just figuring out how to balance all of those things all at once when you have an hour session, or sometimes even less than that. And so I think that's a big barrier that I'm seeing, that I'm learning actually a lot from my colleagues too, watching them teach and seeing them trying to incorporate some of these elements into their lessons. But that's something that I'm constantly struggling with and trying to overcome.
Yeah, I really, that really resonates with me. I agree with everything Andrea said. It can be difficult to know how much to spend on this message we want to get across versus everything else you have to cover. But it's a little challenging, but we're up to the challenge.
Thank you. Yeah, and we'll include links to the resources that our panelists have mentioned in the chat, and also in the transcript afterwards. I'm curious now. I think it's hard to not talk about COVID, but with everyone working remotely, I'm curious to know how. Well, COVID has brought our attention to health information in a way that hasn't been highlighted before, and public health being something that's very top of mind, and it's really changed the way that we've worked. And so I wonder if you could talk about how your relationships have changed, especially since the way we're working is changing now, and how do you maintain relationships with students and faculty and community? Yeah.
Yeah, I think the biggest way that I've seen this change is, I mean, like, I'm sure everyone is on an online environment, obviously, now. But I think actually for the work that my library has been doing around anti-racism specifically, it's actually been a positive change in terms of having that online environment than before, where we would have had things in person. So at my library, we were sort of in charge of putting together an anti-racism reading group, and we're actually having our second session next week, which I'm really excited about. But I think that in the before COVID, I feel like people, the people who've participated would have probably been mostly faculty or students. But because we're in this online environment, I have seen a lot of people from the Tufts Medical Center, which is attached to the medical school here in Boston, come and join and sign up. And I think that there's been this sort of this thirst for figuring out how people can be anti-racist within their workspaces within the hospital because of all of this. I mean, there's been a lot of things out there saying, like, talking about racism and the relationship between racism and medical care and health. But I think people are now feeling the momentum of needing to address these in their everyday jobs. And so I feel like because of this online environment, more people from the hospital are able to join. And it's just like an hour session where they do the reading and they join and talk about these things. So for me, I feel like it's been somewhat of a positive change in terms of having more of that relationship between the hospital folks. But that's one observation from my work.
For me, my library was already online and accessed exclusively remotely, so that part didn't change. But the way clinicians work has changed. There's much more of an emphasis on telemedicine, which will hopefully remain with us after the pandemic because it improves disparities in underserved areas. Access to specialty care has always been an issue for rural patients and healthcare providers. So telehealth is helping to bridge that gap. And the pandemic has also provided us with an arena to raise awareness of health disparities because there is so much being studied about disparities during the pandemic, partly due to the fact that people of color are not getting vaccinated at the same rate as white people. So I think these changes will remain with us, and it has given us the opportunity to kind of bring those to the forefront. And I think that we'll be able to keep doing that.
Yeah, I mean, so in terms of my own work, I happen to be on sabbatical this year. And so my work has changed very different in many different ways, but I am located in Alberta, so I don't know if anyone here is in Alberta currently, but there's some rampant misinformation, like I assume everywhere. But we really do see kind of the way that people are dealing with COVID as being so different. Different communities, when we think about authority being constructed and contextual, that's certainly true in communities in Alberta right now. And so we can see the way that the approach for Indigenous communities, the way that Indigenous communities are being prioritized in terms of receiving vaccine, in terms of receiving information, and even other specific communities, right? Making sure that health information is available in Punjabi, right? Making sure it's available in Mandarin. Like, there's very specific ways that kind of different communities are approaching COVID. And I think that we really see an interesting kind of framing that's coming from that, right? One of the ways is like, oh my gosh, why don't these people want to get vaccines? They just don't understand that it's good for them. But there's very real realities that people are bringing into their mistrust of healthcare, right? I mean, Patricia spoke about that right away, right? We have a legacy of stuff where we literally have health studies that were done on unknowing participants from racialized groups. And so I think that as we're adjusting kind of our work in this time of COVID, the understanding of that history and the understanding that, I don't think it's people being absolutely outrageous to not believe in vaccination because of this process, right? Because of this legacy that we inherit. And so it's been really exciting for me to see news from isolated communities, Indigenous communities, where elders are speaking about their choices to get vaccinated, right? They're speaking about why they're choosing to do it for their grandchildren in terms of the way that they're thinking about this knowledge, right, that they carry in their bodies, in their minds, in their stories, in their songs. It's really exciting to see that in often very isolated places. And so that's really been an interesting component of our work right here, is right, thinking about that history that communities kind of take on, but then also the way that people are interacting with that. There's a really exciting thing. James McCocus, who's a Cree doctor, was just in Kahiwin Cree Nation, and they were doing vaccinations there. And the first vaccination that they did, they opened it with ceremony to just be very clear that what we're doing here is important, not only just sort of for white people or for this global pandemic, but that what we're doing here is actually preserving, maintaining cultural knowledge, right? Vaccination is more than just simply, oh, you're going to be healthy. But by being healthy, this means that we can continue to have cultural transmission. And so it's an interesting framing, and I think it's really exciting to see in our work.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just going to move to our last prepared question before audience Q&A. The three of you are at different points in your careers. So do you have any advice or questions or things you want to share with each other? For example, like how do you deal with burnout or isolation? Like, for example, if you're the only health librarian in your organization, how do you build those relationships with colleagues within your organization and outside? And yeah, how do you connect with others in the field?
Oh, Patricia, did you want to go first?
No, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Being so new to the field, I don't know necessarily if I have any advice, but one thing that I do want to talk about is dealing with like burnout and isolation. And I don't necessarily know if I figured out a way to deal with it yet, because I think that, you know, it's been incredibly hard with the pandemic going on and just working from home and not having this sort of balance of you know, work and then just your resting time. But one thing that I have found really helpful is that, and I'm so grateful to have this, is that, you know, this morning, our research and instruction librarian team, we were having a meeting, and my supervisor was essentially saying that you shouldn't have to feel like you're being like super productive during a pandemic, and you shouldn't have to push yourself in that way. And she really encouraged all of us to be kind to ourselves. And I think that from what I've been seeing, it's not so, I mean, part of it is I need to learn how to deal with the burnout and the isolation, but also like having that supportive environment from your supervisor and having someone who is in a position of power saying that it's okay if you have a day or a week where you just don't feel like you're being productive at all, and that's fine. I think it's so important. So I just wanted to say that for all the supervisors who are out there, like, you know, think about how you can be supportive to the people you're supervising, because I've been finding that so helpful. And the other thing is she's also encouraging me to, you know, I think a lot of the times, like any sort of anti-racism work, social justice, racial justice work is sort of seen as an extra thing tagged onto your job. And it's not part of my job description, right? It's my job description is, you know, being a liaison to one of the schools and doing data management related stuff. But really her and a lot of my colleagues have been very supportive in framing that as a part of my job. And so making that a priority and having an environment where that's okay has been really helpful as well. So I just wanted to speak to that and encourage other supervisors to do something similar.
That's a really good point, Andrea. I'm lucky to have that at the University of Washington too. The expectation that we may not be as productive as we are when there's not a pandemic, and to be kind to ourselves, and we're being encouraged to take leave. And sometimes we forget because we can't go on vacation, so we forget to just take days off, but we're being encouraged to do that. I also think a way to avoid burnout is to connect with other librarians in other places, even if they're not at your own organization. And I think social media is an excellent way for health librarians to remain connected and learn about new developments. And if you're not a Twitter or Facebook user, you can connect to others by using hashtags and find other users who have the same interests that you do. And you can connect to the communities that you serve that way. So I think that's a good way to stay in touch. And also joining professional organizations is a good way to connect and communicate with others, even if it's just through listservs. You can also join committees and participate in conferences such as this one. And I think that all really helps with the burnout and with the connection.
I just wanted to shout out Susie Bear. So I don't know if you can see this. This is a book, Aboriginal and Visible Minority Librarians. It's a book that came out a couple of years ago. It's looking at a number of librarians' experiences, but the first chapter is by Susie Bear, who was a librarian at Prince Albert Parkland Health Region. I believe she's retired now. But she's a Cree and Saulteaux librarian. She's from Musqueam First Nation. And in it, I think she talks exactly about what we're talking about here, right? The importance of a good manager in managing kind of your work, especially if you're a solo librarian, and thinking about, in her case, she's connected to other health librarians. And so thinking about, you know, if you're the only one for your region within the province, what are the other regions, right? What are other librarians doing? She does such a good job of thinking even about, you know, the shifts that were happening at that time. This book is, you know, it's a couple years old, and we see the shifts. You know, she's talking about the shifts to online information that we're essentially living in right now. And so that idea of getting clinicians into your sessions is hard then, and is hard now, because a lot of times, yeah, it's seen as kind of a separate thing. But I think the thing that I have appreciated the most about being in this field is that librarians are intensely curious people. And so I think that there's a lot of interesting work that's done when people are feeding that curiosity. They're interested in what other people are doing. And this idea, especially in health librarianship, that change is consistent, right? So what you may have been teaching people for 20 years can get flipped on its head right away. And that's, instead of seeing that sort of as like a very stressful, overwhelming situation, I think it's exciting. And I think that it's so exciting to see the new information that is coming through consistently. And so it's a big ask to stay on top of it, certainly, but I think it's it keeps things from getting boring, certainly. So that connection to curiosity and connection to other people in the field is so essential, I think.
There's a question in the chat from Nancy Shin about, well, I'll just read it. Here, what approach do you take in incorporating knowledge of health disparities in your curriculum without making people from BIPOC communities uncomfortable or pressured to speak up? And I would say that being aware that if there's a person of color in the room, they don't speak for everyone, and it's not their job to explain everything to everyone else. So I think avoiding that situation, just don't do that. And also incorporating the health disparities into curriculum or teaching or search results, it's time to just normalize it and just act like it's part of what we're supposed to be doing. And I think not seeing it as an extra thing is a good way to move forward.
Yeah, and I think going off of what Patricia said about making sure that people know that people of color are not the spokesperson for their groups or their racial identity or ethnic identity, you can incorporate that in community guidelines. So that's something that when we were planning our anti-racism reading group, we have a line saying that we will not tokenize the experiences of people of color. And so I think that's one way that you can do that.
I think it's really exciting to think about the work that's being done in this area too. There's, I think, a lot of exciting discussion is happening around like an ethic of care when we're thinking about creating in our spaces. And so really thinking about the way that we have a relationship to the material, but we also have a relationship to the communities that are represented in that material. We have a responsibility to those communities. We have a responsibility to sort of an imagined audience, but then the real audience that we have in front of us too. And so, you know, thinking about that ethic of care that it can exist in our teaching and the way that we're organizing our resources, I think helps shape the way that we're trying to just be more accountable to people. I think oftentimes it's also intervention, right? And so when we're reading old health literature that's using outdated terms, that's using, it has outdated information in it. What's the intervention that we have there, right? And so we're in a uniquely positioned place where we can do that intervention, unlike when someone sort of like comes upon literature on their own. When we are sort of in that position, we can sort of trigger this ethic of care that we can kind of give people additional information, that the process of thinking about connection and the accountability that we have to not only the materials that we take care of, but the people, the communities that are represented there.
Thank you. We have another question. I think many of us are very aware of increased burdens on our BIPOC colleagues with expectations around participation in things like diversity, equity, and inclusion committees. Do you have any recommendations for easing that burden while still supporting their voices?
As someone who's on so many committees, like, I don't know. No, no, I do think that it's a lot of educating ourselves, right? There might be a push to be the wokest, right? But nobody is born knowing all of these things, right? All of us have a lived experience of some kind. We have these life experiences that we bring to our work and to the kind of librarianship that we do. But we also don't know about everyone's experiences. And so one of the biggest things I think is just education is so helpful. And there's so many resources of it. Like, we are literally librarians. We can find the stuff that can help us be better at doing our jobs. I think the implicit bias that Patricia brought up too is really interesting too, because the point is it's implicit, right? It's stuff that we don't even know exists. And so it's helpful to be prompted into those spaces sometimes. The concept of, I think, discomfort and change is really, really challenging, but I think it's so necessary. I think sometimes people like to think about new diversity, equity, and inclusion concepts as like a fun multicultural platter, right? It's like, we're going to get to have food from everywhere. We're going to see some dances. We're going to learn some fun facts. But in reality, it's often learning about like the traumas that various people have experienced. And so there's such an empathy that's required there, but then it's also sort of a care and an accountability and just kind of reckoning with these systems that we have inherited and that we're using. So it's, yeah, I think education is a starting point. And then truly just like not asking, like letting people go and do their own thing if they want to. So yeah, I mean, I don't know how good of an answer that is, but yeah, as someone who's on so many committees, I would love to be on less.
I would also just add, don't expect people to be on committees, but be sure to provide the opportunity.
Yeah, I think that piece of just like letting people volunteer for the thing that they want to do instead of pushing them to is really important. Just again, like if they do choose to do this work, if people of color do choose to do this work, then making it known that this is like a part of their job and that they're being compensated for it and not just expecting free labor, I think is really important. I guess for someone who's not on a lot of committees right now, I do have a question for both Patricia and Jessie. I was wondering, you know, I feel like there are so many projects that interest me in terms of anti-racism work, and I want to do all of them, but I don't have time to do all of them. So I guess my question is, how do you prioritize which ones you want to be a part of and that you can contribute to, and how do you resist the urge to do all of them?
It's not easy to resist the urge to say yes to everything, but we have to do that. And sometimes efforts can overlap if you are doing research for an article, for example, you might be able to use it in your discussions to decide a new policy in another group. So maybe kind of trying to tailor the interest a little bit so that there's common themes in what you're doing.
For me, it's largely thinking about like what is the ethics that are guiding this project, right? Is this something that people can do on their own, right? Am I existing merely to educate non-Indigenous people about indigeneity? I don't need to be there, right? That's also work that has been done for many, many years, right? Like we have decades of anti-racism workshops, of education, of people really putting out really incredible research on these exact topics. And I think that oftentimes, if my presence on a committee is largely to do that, I'm not really interested in doing that. And I think over time, I've learned to get a little bit more clear about that work, right? About that boundary. I think I also, and I know that this is true from literature that we know about racialized librarians, racialized researchers, but there's a whole other set of responsibilities that comes with being in a community. And so we can think about even thinking about care, right? So thinking about children, thinking about caring for parents, right? There's this whole other life that I think is really important and that people bring to their work and is important to maintain, right? But it also means that people have to work so much more, right? It also asks of us sometimes, if you're not on this committee, you may be the only Indigenous person at this institution. So if you're not on this committee on Indigenous issues, there will be no Indigenous voices here. And so that's a hard thing to walk away from, right? If you walk into a room and everyone's white and you think, oh God, I gotta hold it down for everyone. I mean, it's hard to walk away from a committee like that, right? Because in many cases you think, what level of misinformation is going to go forward? There's going to be such a bias in the results in the report that might be created from this. And so I think for racialized colleagues, it's a burden, right? And so I gotta say, being on sabbatical, a great way to get off of committees, because you're just like, I'm simply not here. But I truly think that having people in your corner, a manager, a supervisor who can check in with you to say, is this committee actually fitting into your workload, right? Is this something that is going to take over too much of your time? I think that's so useful to do. And if you don't have a supportive manager, I think it often takes place in you laying that stuff out, right? And saying, this is what I have capacity for, and this is what I'm bringing to this position. And so I'm really interested in kind of keeping it to 3 committees or something that I want to do that's actually feeding me too, right? So some of our committees we do because there's sort of a accountability or responsibility for it, and other ones we do because it's feeding us. So it's useful to sort of sort that out.
Thank you for both your answers.
If there aren't any other questions from the audience, I have some more questions, but yeah, please leave your questions in the chat. I'll just wait a couple of seconds if folks want to think. Maybe I'll ask my question. I'm just a little mindful of time. I kind of want to touch on what Jessie in particular has mentioned with care. And because I think that care and health and access to information, like that's all related. So does addressing like misinformation factor into your work? And I'm also trying to connect this with trust, because we are librarians, not healthcare providers, and if medical or health librarians are usually situated within a university or within institutions that have a legacy of harm, like how do we create that trust? Yeah, and I was wondering if anyone had any thoughts on that.
I've got a run, so I'm going to go really quick.
Okay.
I think it's all interconnected, right? We're working on kind of thinking about our own professional identity as one that engenders trust, when the reality is, and so for so many cases, there's misinformation, there's distrust, and very real distrust, right? This is based in reality. And so I think it oftentimes is looking very hard at our own work and our own biases, thinking about the structures that we've created and thinking, who's this serving, right? I mean, who is it created by? And second of all, who does it serve best? And then of course, that most important third question is like, who's not being served by this at all? And that's the hardest one to answer, I think, because we don't know what we don't know. And so a lot of times that's a lot of hard community work. It's doing that empathetic work. It's getting out there. It's connecting to other people that are actually serving different communities and realizing where our blind spots are. But I'm going to say goodbye, but thank you, everyone. I really appreciated this conversation.
Thank you, Jessie.
I think also focusing on evidence-based resources in our work is important, and creating and promoting community partnerships so that we're getting help with the message we're trying to create from communities we want to serve, so that it's not, we're making sure that we're getting others' perspectives. So we're checking on the viewpoints of the communities we serve and seeing how things are affecting them, as well as emphasizing in our teaching the difference between opinion and just what's always been done and evidence-based medicine. There, in medicine, part of how decisions are made is general knowledge and experience of colleagues, and that's part of it, but that should be the smallest part, and the evidence of the research, peer-reviewed research studies and the clinical trials is what should guide decisions more. And that's changing all the time. And so stressing the importance of keeping up to date with evidence-based sources is a good way for us to get that message across.
Yeah, I definitely agree with Patricia. And I think I see this happening with one of my colleagues who's the dental librarian at my library, and she does this really well in terms of incorporating it into her lessons on critically appraising research. And a part of that is looking at the biases, right? And it's not just about biases within like the research methodology, but it's like biases in terms of like racial biases and gender and things like that. And so I think it's actually a fairly good transition into talking about biases that normally wouldn't have been talked about within that critical appraisal lesson. So yeah, I see colleagues do that really well.
Great, thank you. I think we're just about at time. Thank you so much for your time today. If folks want to reach you online, where can they find you?
They can either email me at andrea.kang@tufts.edu, or I guess on Twitter, AMKANG27. I think that's my Twitter handle.
And I put my email address in the chat, duvine@uw.edu.
Thank you. And we'll have all of that and Jessie's as well in the transcript. I'm just going to read our outro really quickly. So the podcast can be found on Twitter at organizingpod. That's organizing with a Z and not an S. And our email is organizingideaspod@gmail.com. And our website is organizingideas.wordpress.com. Where you can find links to things that we've mentioned, as well as transcripts to the episodes. And Alice and I are sort of transitioning into like new jobs and whatnot, so we'll see when we can get this episode up. But thank you everyone for attending, and Patricia, Andrea, and Jessie, this was a really fantastic conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you all so much for coming. That was really great to hear, and I love listening to a really fruitful discussion between you guys, and certainly some ideas for my own work. For anyone who is continuing on in the conference, the next presentations will start at 12:15, so we have a break from now until then. Thank you so much for coming, and we'll see you again shortly.